Trump has made it clear that he only opposes lawful immigration when non-white people immigrate to the United States. His immigration agenda isn't about public safety or economic stability or jobs. It's about racism. It was racist during his first administration. It's racist now. And like his first administration, he's hired a bunch of racists to carry it out. In fact, I'm gonna pause here really quickly. I know we're talking about TPS, but I don't know if anyone else has mentioned the fact that ICE agents were literally dragging a pregnant woman just this week in a viral video. So don't tell me that this isn't about cruelty, because it is. Moving on. The president is now on record admitting to calling majority Black and brown nations, quote, shithole countries. He consistently refers to Black and brown people as, quote, low IQ, stupid, or nasty. His agenda is about one thing: giving racial preference to specific...
Right, so you just watched Representative Jasmine Crockett stand in the well of Congress and do something that apparently still shocks centrist media and sends conservative outlets into conniptions, because she refuses to euphemize what everyone with eyes can see. She named the thing that decent people have known since 2015, when that escalator ride descended into American political hell. And here we are nearly a decade later, watching ICE agents kneel on a pregnant woman in Minneapolis snow and drag her across frozen pavement while bystanders scream that she cannot breathe. And still we're supposed to pretend this isn't about race. Trump himself said migrants are poisoning the blood of our country, and claimed undocumented immigrants who commit murder have bad genes, which is literal eugenics rhetoric straight from the fascist playbook. And yet somehow Crockett is the controversial one for pointing out the obvious. Listen to what she's saying, because this is the clarion call moment. ICE agents handcuffed a pregnant woman, forced her onto her stomach, and put their full body weight and knees on her just days ago in South Minneapolis, and people yelled at immigration and customs enforcement agents to release the woman, claiming she is pregnant and couldn't breathe. After kneeling on her, an agent later dragged the woman by one arm on her back toward a vehicle, and this is happening right now in December 2025, under an administration that has made its racial animus the centerpiece of its entire governing philosophy. We need to understand the architecture of cruelty being constructed in real time, because the current resettlement agenda favors white South Africans and European immigration hawks, while simultaneously the main group being welcomed under Trump is white South Africans, which tells you everything about whose humanity counts in this administration's calculus and whose does not. Trump expanded travel restrictions, adding countries including Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, South Sudan, and Syria, and people with Palestinian Authority-issued travel documents are also fully restricted from U.S. travel just this week, literally 2 days ago, systematically targeting majority Black and brown nations while welcoming white refugees claiming persecution. The doublethink is staggering, except it's not doublethink at all when you recognize the ideological through-line. The GOP platform stated, Republicans will use existing federal law to keep foreign Christian-hating communists, Marxists, and socialists out of America, which is McCarthyism wedding itself to theocratic nationalism, wedding itself to racial exclusion in one tidy fascistic package. And somehow we're still debating whether calling this racist constitutes incivility rather than accurate description. The spectacle of state violence we witnessed in that viral Minneapolis footage where residents hurled snowballs at federal officers after they pinned the woman to the snow-covered ground during the administration's Operation Metro Surge represents the inevitable endpoint of rhetoric that dehumanizes entire populations, because once you've spent years convincing your base that migrants are invaders, poisoning American blood, then the logical policy manifestation is jackbooted enforcement that treats human beings like enemy combatants on a battlefield. Local advocates said the immigration enforcers' saturation tactics, where they perform multiple public arrests, are designed to intimidate communities, which is textbook authoritarian governance. You saturate neighborhoods with armed federal agents conducting sweeps to generate terror that extends far beyond the individuals actually detained. You want entire communities living in fear. And before anyone retreats into that tired discourse about law and order and legal versus illegal immigration, Trump has halted immigration processing, expanded travel ban rules, and launched reviews that could upend cases approved over the last 4 years, while announcing a handful of policy shifts, including a pause on asylum decisions, a review of cases under the Biden administration, and a re-examination of certain green card holders, which means lawful permanent residents who followed every rule are now having their status weaponized against them in retrospective purges. Crockett pointed directly at the shithole countries comment, and listen, this matters viscerally because Trump has now related to the crowd, a meeting in which he said, "Why is it we only take people from shithole countries? Right? Why can't we have some people from Norway, Sweden, just a few? Literally within the past week at a rally in Pennsylvania. He's not even hiding it anymore. He's saying the quiet part at full volume into microphones because he knows his base rewards candor about racial hierarchies more than it punishes bigotry. When Crockett says Trump called majority black and brown nations shithole countries and labeled black and brown people low IQ, stupid, or nasty, she's not engaging in hyperbole. She's reading from the record. Trump has deployed these exact formulations repeatedly, and his senior advisor Stephen Miller, Trump has been emboldened by to launch a shock and awe blitz of executive orders, told the New York Times. Trump will unleash the vast arsenal of federal powers to implement the most spectacular migration crackdown, which sounds like someone gleefully anticipating state-sponsored brutality. The ideological coherence of this agenda becomes undeniable when you examine the infrastructure being erected. The overall strategy includes a plan to eventually hold up to 30,000 detainees at the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, because apparently the symbolism of using America's most notorious extrajudicial detention facility wasn't ominous enough. So let's just make it official immigration policy, and the administration rescinded long-standing guidelines prohibiting most arrests in sensitive locations, such as schools, faith-based institutions, and hospitals, which means children can be snatched from classrooms, and patients can be apprehended from hospital beds, because in the calculus of white nationalist governance, no space deserves protection when brown bodies occupy it. The Trump administration has embraced the theatrics of an immigration crackdown, sharing photos of men arrested by immigration officials on social media, trying to induce fear and terror in immigrant populations to get them to self-deport, which scholars explicitly compare to Operation Wetback from the Eisenhower era. They're not even developing new playbooks, they're resurrecting the explicitly racist enforcement campaigns of the 1950s and rebranding them as border security. Now watch how the system immunizes itself against moral clarity, because when Crockett speaks these truths, the response from conservative media, and even some centrist outlets focuses not on the substance of her claims, but on her tone, her passion, the alleged impropriety of calling racism racist when committed by powerful white men. This is the eternal derailment tactic where the person naming oppression becomes more offensive than the oppression itself. She talks about ICE dragging a pregnant woman, and the right-wing response fixates on whether Democrats are being sufficiently respectful to enforcement officers. DHS Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin said federal officers were targeting a vehicle when protesters threw rocks, chunks of ice, assaulted officers, and used pepper spray against the officers. The officers sustained multiple injuries, including cuts, McLaughlin said in a statement, adding that 2 people were charged with assaulting federal officers and remain in custody. Officers tried to arrest the woman shown in the video because she rushed an ICE vehicle and attempted to vandalize it, but even accepting DHS's narrative at face value, does that justify kneeling on a pregnant woman's stomach in sub-freezing temperatures? Does property damage warrant potential harm to a fetus? These are the moral equations that get obscured when we refuse to interrogate the racial logic animating enforcement priorities. The constitutional crisis brewing here extends far beyond immigration policy into the fundamental question of personhood and who gets counted as fully human under American law, because Trump officials expanded a procedure to speed up deportations to include undocumented immigrants anywhere in the U.S. who cannot prove they've lived in the U.S. continuously for 2 years or more, through expedited removal, which allows immigration authorities to remove an individual without a hearing before an immigration judge, broadening its powers to deport undocumented immigrants, which is due process being obliterated in service of efficiency metrics. You can now be expelled from the only country you've known without ever seeing a judge if you cannot produce 2 years of continuous documentation, which, if you understand anything about how undocumented people survive, you know that documentation is precisely what they often cannot maintain. And then there's the absolutely Orwellian nightmare of Operation Irish Goodbye, where the Trump administration plans to deploy immigration agents to the U.S.-Mexico border to arrest undocumented migrants trying to return home voluntarily during the holidays. ICE and CBP would conduct targeted operations at southern border ports to detain people self-removing and place them in formal deportation proceedings. Detaining migrants who leave voluntarily may be aimed to impose long-term re-entry penalties, which means even choosing to leave becomes criminalized. Even voluntary departure gets transmuted into formal removal with all its attendant penalties. The cruelty is not incidental, it is the foundational principle. Crockett's assertion that this agenda is about illegal racial preference rather than law enforcement finds overwhelming empirical support when you examine the disparate treatment. Deportation Data Project shows that ICE arrested nearly 75,000 people with no criminal record under Trump, contradicting the administration's own propaganda about prioritizing dangerous criminals, and broader analysis reveals the proportion of immigrants convicted of violent crimes has dropped from the Biden administration's 10 to 7% during the Trump administration, meaning they're actually deprioritizing violent offenders in favor of mass sweeps that maximize raw deportation numbers regardless of public safety considerations. This is not about making America safer, this is about making America whiter, and the evidence arrives daily in the form of policy after policy that systematically advantages European immigration while constructing impossible barriers for Latin American, African, Caribbean, and Middle Eastern migrants. Trump's central immigration promise was encapsulated by delegates waving signs calling for mass deportations now at the Republican National Convention, with the main goal seeming to be to reduce the number of foreigners in the United States to the greatest extent possible, which scholars analyzing contemporary Republican immigration politics describe as a radical departure from even the restrictionist conservatism of previous eras. The historical parallels Crockett could invoke would illuminate how American immigration policy has always served as the legal architecture for racial caste, how Chinese exclusion and the national origins quota system and Operation Wetback each represented their era's attempt to preserve white demographic dominance, how the 1965 Hart-Celler Act's ostensible colorblindness got subverted through enforcement priorities and resource allocation, how the militarization of the border beginning in the 1990s concentrated migrant crossings into the deadliest terrain leading to thousands of preventable deaths, how the post-9/11 security state fused xenophobia with Islamophobia to justify surveillance and detention regimes that would have been politically impossible decades earlier. We are living through the next chapter of this long, shameful history, except now the president says the quiet part's loud and his base loves him for it. Trump said that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the United States, language that echoes language Adolf Hitler once used, and this is not the first time that Trump has used this phrase, yet he faces no meaningful electoral penalty from Republican voters. Instead, his polling improves when he escalates the dehumanization, because the Republican base has been primed for decades to view demographic change as civilizational threat. And here is where Crockett's analysis becomes most incisive, because she's naming the administrative apparatus being assembled to operationalize white nationalism. She mentions that Trump hired a bunch of racists to carry it out, and look at who populates the immigration enforcement infrastructure. Former senior Trump officials helped write Project 2025, a detailed plan to overhaul federal agencies that includes more than 175 immigration actions, which represents the bureaucratization of ethnic cleansing fantasies. You have Heritage Foundation ideologues drafting 1,000-page policy wish lists that include ending temporary protected status, TPS, deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, and visas for victims of crime, TNU visas, which would strip legal protections from hundreds of thousands of people, pushing them into undocumented status and making them vulnerable to deportation, which could have a severe impact on individuals seeking refuge from violence or natural disasters. Because the goal is maximum removal, irrespective of humanitarian considerations, or economic impact or family unity, or any value besides racial purity, masquerading as national sovereignty. The pregnant woman being dragged across Minneapolis ice crystallizes everything. It's the visual representation of state power wielded without mercy against those deemed expendable. We don't control the unsafe or questionable tactics by other agents that are here, Minneapolis Police Department Chief Brian O'Hara told reporters, adding that the tactics used did not jibe with his Christian values, which is the local police chief publicly stating that federal immigration enforcement tactics violate basic moral standards. Think about that for a moment. Even law enforcement officials accustomed to state violence are registering alarm at ICE's methods. Former Minnesota state legislator Hoden Hassan believes ICE tactics are becoming more harsh as the Minneapolis-St. Paul operation continues, saying the first week they were not very aggressive. They were stopping people. Second week we saw them really aggressive. They were stopping people. Second week we saw them really aggressive. Documenting the escalation in real time. This is testing the boundaries of what communities will tolerate, pushing further each week to normalize brutality that would have sparked immediate backlash just months earlier. Let's address the reflexive conservative counter-argument that Crockett's characterization constitutes demagoguery or racial grievance mongering, because this deflection depends on willful blindness to documented patterns. Trump has not simply advocated restrictionist immigration policies within normal ideological parameters. He has explicitly and repeatedly racialized immigration discourse in ways that break with decades of bipartisan consensus. Even conservative Republicans like George W. Bush, who wanted tighter border security, still spoke about immigrants in humanizing terms and supported pathways to citizenship. Most Republicans at the national level, strongly supported by business, tended to endorse policies that encouraged the easy flow of workers across the border and increased levels of legal immigration. Prominent conservative Republicans also rejected vilifying rhetoric towards undocumented Americans. They presented all immigrants as pursuing opportunities for their families, emphasizing a shared vision of the American dream. Their labor contributed to the economy and America's growth and prosperity. But around 2009, a dramatic shift took place, with the Tea Party movement bringing border security and racial resentment towards immigrants center stage, and Trump exploited and accelerated this transformation until naked xenophobia became party orthodoxy. The data undergirding public opinion shifts reveals how manufactured this moral panic truly is. The number of undocumented immigrants in the U.S. was actually declining from 12.2 million in 2007 to 10.7 million in 2016, during the precise period when Republican rhetoric reached fever pitch, meaning the intensity of anti-immigrant sentiment bore inverse relationship to actual immigration levels. It was never about the numbers, it was about the politics of racial resentment as animating force for Republican base mobilization. And now we're witnessing the policy manifestation, as the current pace of deportations suggests the administration will fall well short of its stated goal of 1 million deportations annually. Based on Federal Register notices, it appears on track to deport roughly 500,000 people this year, fewer than the 685,000 deportations recorded in fiscal year 2024 under President Joe Biden, which reveals the performative dimension. The cruelty serves political theater more than it serves stated policy objectives. The point is to generate spectacle that satisfies the base's desire to see brown people suffering, rather than to actually solve any definable problem. When Crockett insists this is about racial preference rather than legality, she's identifying how selective enforcement functions as racialized social control. The administration broadcasts images of shackled deportees to send messages about who belongs and who doesn't. Amid relatively low numbers of ICE arrests and deportations, Trump's administration sought to inflate the presence of deportations in media, such as by posting images of shackled deportees on social media. Because the spectacle matters more than the substance, every viral image of brown people in chains reinforces the white nationalist narrative about reclaiming our country from them. And the propaganda works precisely because it taps into deep American anxieties about demographic change, about the approaching moment when white Americans become a numerical minority, about the cultural transformations attending globalization and migration, about economic precarity that gets redirected from capitalism toward immigrants. Trump didn't create these anxieties, but he weaponized them with unprecedented shamelessness. He gave permission for people to voice prejudices that had been socially stigmatized. He made racism respectable again in mainstream political discourse by modeling it from the presidential podium. The constitutional implications extend into existential territory, because Attorney General Pam Bondi issued a directive allowing law enforcement officials to enter the homes of migrants without warrants, which obliterates Fourth Amendment protections for an entire category of people, establishing that constitutional rights are not universal but contingent on immigration status. And once you've created that precedent, the police state expands to encompass anyone the regime defines as other. This is how democracies die, not through military coups but through the gradual accretion of emergency powers that get normalized then never rescinded, through the designation of populations as threats requiring extraordinary measures, through the steady erosion of rights beginning with the most vulnerable, and eventually consuming everyone outside the protected class. We've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. Crockett is screaming the warning that historians will later ask why we ignored. The counter-mobilization we're witnessing in places like Minneapolis, where communities blow whistles to alert neighbors about ICE presence and throw snowballs at federal agents, represents grassroots resistance, asserting human solidarity against state violence. Residents hurled snowballs at the agents and blew whistles to alert other neighbors. The visual of a vulnerable person being held against the sub-zero ground while bystanders pleaded for her safety has immediately triggered a firestorm of local and national condemnation. But we need national leadership willing to name what's happening, and Crockett provides exactly that. She refuses the euphemistic language that obscures reality. She calls it racism because that's what it is. She points to the pregnant woman, because that image indicts the entire apparatus. The administration's response to criticism predictably invokes law and order and officer safety. But when police arrived, they did not see violence against federal officers, and left in an effort to de-escalate the situation. According to local police, meaning even law enforcement called to the scene assessed that ICE was exaggerating threats to justify their tactics. This is manufactured justification after the fact. The economic dimensions merit examination, because Trump and his allies claim this is about protecting American workers and wages. Experts have warned that the abrupt removal of millions of immigrants would likely lead to economic instability, particularly in industries heavily reliant on undocumented labor, such as agriculture and hospitality, and the real agenda surfaces when you examine which industries get targeted versus which get exempted. Agricultural employers dependent on exploited migrant labor will receive carve-outs while immigrant-owned small businesses in urban centers face raids. The pattern reveals class warfare, wearing the mask of immigration enforcement, and a lack of funds, detention space, officers and infrastructure to handle arrested immigrants is frustrating many involved in the effort-made goals, such as 1 million deportations this year, seem unrealistic. That urgency led the White House to ask Congress for an immediate infusion of $175 billion to build out the deportation infrastructure, so we supposedly don't have money for healthcare or education or infrastructure, but we can find nearly $200 billion to rip families apart. These are the choices of an empire in decay, prioritizing punishment over human flourishing. Crockett pointing to the viral video and saying, "Don't tell me that this isn't about cruelty, because it is," cuts through every justification, every rationalization, every attempt to sanitize what's happening. The cruelty is the point. As Adam Serwer famously wrote, "It's not an unfortunate side effect of necessary enforcement. The suffering is the objective, because suffering serves the political function of demonstrating who holds power and who exists at their mercy." Project 2025 foresees the regular use of tear gas to repel migrants, the deployment of heat ray technology to make asylum seekers feel like their skin is on fire, or shoot-to-kill orders for anyone who rushes the U.S. border. And these proposals aren't emerging from fringe white nationalist forums. They're in Heritage Foundation policy documents being written by former senior administration officials who will return to power if Trump wins. This is the stated agenda. Believe them when they tell you who they are. The systematic nature of this becomes undeniable when you see Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem recommending that Trump's travel ban list expand to include between 30 to 32 countries, an increase from the current list of 19 countries, which would encompass probably a majority of majority Black and Muslim majority nations globally. This is architecting apartheid at the international scale, deciding which nationalities deserve access to American opportunity based on racial and religious criteria that violate every stated American value about equality and merit. And the propaganda apparatus supporting this agenda pumps out misinformation about immigrants that has long been a tool of political fear-mongering, but Trump has taken it to new heights using false narratives to incite fear and rally his base, heavily relying on the rhetorical tactic of associating migrants with criminality through sensationalist anecdotes, exaggeration, and outright lies, even though a range of studies by academics and think tanks have shown that immigrants do not commit crime at a higher rate than native-born Americans, and a working paper finds that relative to the U.S.-born, immigrants' incarceration rates have declined since 1960, with immigrants today 60% less likely to be incarcerated. But facts cannot compete with viral videos and Fox News fear segments that construct an alternate reality where immigrant criminality represents existential threat. What makes Crockett such a vital voice in this moment is her willingness to speak with moral clarity that matches the urgency of the crisis. She's not calibrating her language to appeal to mythical moderate voters who might be offended by calling racism racist. She's naming the system as it operates and demanding accountability from those enabling it. She's saying out loud that the emperor has no clothes and the emperor is a racist. The gasps of pearl-clutching from centrist commentators who think she's being too strident or too divisive or too something reveal how invested mainstream political discourse remains in preserving a veneer of civility that obscures underlying violence. They would rather tone police Crockett than confront the reality she's describing, because confronting that reality requires admitting complicity or at minimum willful ignorance. Better to focus on whether she used appropriate congressional decorum than whether ICE is kneeling on pregnant women. Better to debate her rhetoric than Trump's policies. This is how atrocities get normalized, through the insistence that describing them forthrightly constitutes the real transgression. The choice before us could not be starker. We either recognize this as the authoritarian white nationalist project it manifestly is, and mobilize accordingly, or we continue pretending that normal political combat and fact-checking and appeals to better angels will somehow constrain this movement. Crockett understands we're past that point. She's calling for resistance rooted in moral conviction that refuses to accept the unacceptable. She's demanding that we see the pregnant woman being dragged across ice and understand that could be anyone the regime defines as unwelcome, that could be your neighbor, your coworker, your friend, that could eventually be you once they've normalized this level of violence against the initial targets. This is how state terror operates. It begins with populations that majorities can be persuaded deserve harsh treatment, then expands inexorably once the mechanisms are in place. History teaches this lesson repeatedly, yet we keep failing to learn until it's too late. Crockett is refusing to wait until it's too late. She's sounding the alarm now, while there's still time to resist, still possibility for collective action to forestall the worst outcomes, but that requires millions of people willing to believe what they're seeing, rather than what comfortable illusions suggest. The pregnant woman in Minneapolis is not an aberration. She's the system working as designed, and Jasmine Crockett standing in Congress saying so represents the kind of leadership this moment desperately needs. Unflinching, uncompromising, absolutely certain that history will vindicate her clarity about what she's naming, while condemning those who enabled atrocity through silence or complicity, or the cowardice of both sidesism. This is it. This is the fight. Immigration enforcement as racial terror is not coming. It's here, and the only question remaining is whether enough Americans will join Crockett in naming it and fighting it before the window closes entirely.